Today, my lovelies, we are going to cover the plant kingdom, kingdom Plantae. We have already done the archaea domain, the bacteria domain. We are in the eukarya domain of the three domains of life. We've covered the kingdom Protista, kingdom fungi, kingdom Animalia, and today we are going to do the plant kingdom. An interesting thing when you're classifying plants, a lot of times scientists will not use the word phylum. They will actually use the word division in place of the word phylum. So what is it? What characteristics should an organism have to classify it as a plant? Scientists use actually a few characteristics to classify plants. Number one, they have to be multicellular. Number two, eukaryotic. Three, photosynthetic. They are autotrophs. They can make their own food, their own glucose to provide energy in the form of ATP to their cells. Their cells have a cell wall. Their covering, the plant covering, is called a cuticle. And that cuticle helps prevent water loss. If you've ever touched a plant leaf, it feels waxy. Some plants have more of a thicker, waxy cuticle, like a cactus, to keep the water inside the plant. Most plants have a stomata, or have stomata, that's the plural, which are specialized openings in surface cells that permit oxygen to get out of the cells and carbon dioxide to get in. So what kinds of plants are we going to learn about today? We're going to learn about how plants can be grouped based on whether or not they produce seeds. So my seeded plants would be over here, and I put my seedless plants over here. Not all plants produce seeds. So your seedless plants can be then further categorized into non-vascular and vascular plants. So plants that don't produce seeds, that are non-vascular, are plants like moss. Vascular plants that don't produce seeds are plants like ferns. And we'll talk about in a little bit more about non-vascular versus vascular. And then in the seeded category, so these are plants that produce seeds, all of them are vascular. You have your gymnosperms, which are your conifers, like evergreens, pine trees. Your Christmas tree, right, is an example of a gymnosperm. They produce seeds, and they protect their seeds in cones, and like pine cones. And then the angiosperms are the flowering plants. So these are kind of what we typically think plants. When we picture plants in our head, we picture flowering plants. So not all plants produce seeds, and not all plants produce flowers. Okay, so the angiosperms are the only kinds of plants that actually produce flowers. A little history of plants. The first plants evolved between 400 and 500 million years ago, from the tallest sequoia in California to the mosses covering the forest floor in Olympic National Park in Washington State. All plants on Earth descended from a common ancestor. Most scientists agree that the ancestor of today's plants was a photosynthetic alga, a protist that lived in aquatic habitats hundreds of millions of years ago. Since the first plants began to grow on land, they've come to dominate nearly every habitat on land. The transition to life on land became possible as plants acquired a few key adaptations, which we will learn about in this lesson. Unlike their algal ancestors, plants needed to control water loss, find new ways to reproduce, and support themselves on land. The story of plants, as you'll see, is largely one about adaptation to life on land. Plants are classified into groups based on their structures. If you looked at a moss and a rose bush, you'd probably guess that they are classified into two different groups. Your conclusion would be correct. While mosses and rose bushes are both members of the plant kingdom, they belong to different taxonomic groups within kingdom Plantae. Two characteristics of plants dominate their classification: the presence or absence of a seed and the presence or absence of vascular tissue. You can see here in the pictures. Let's review real quick what a seed is, and we'll talk about what vascular tissue is as well. You can think of a seed as being analogous to like a chicken egg. I know chickens are not plants and plants are not chickens. Chickens are animals, right? But you've all seen seeds like sunflower seeds, and you know they have typically a hard outer shell, right? Well, the egg that a chicken lays would be similar. The outer shell or the egg itself protects the embryo growing inside, the baby chicken growing inside. Well, same thing with a seed. A seed is a protective structure that contains the plant embryo. And so the presence or absence of seeds is used to classify plants because not all plants actually produce seeds. Now, the other word you're going to hear a lot about today is vascular tissue. The other term is vascular tissue. Vascular tissues are specialized for water and nutrient transport. The presence or absence of these tissues is also used to classify plants. Some plants have vascular tissue, some plants don't. Vascular tissue, if you were thinking about humans, vascular tissue is like our veins and our arteries where our blood flows through, right? The vessels that transport blood. Plants, they don't have blood, but they do have to transport water and nutrients. And so their vascular tissue, or the vessels that the water and the nutrients travel through, are called vascular tissues. Some plants have vascular tissue and some plants do not. So we're going to start right here in Kingdom Plantae, in our seedless plants and the ones that are non-vascular. So seedless, non-vascular plants. And examples of seedless non-vascular plants are mosses and liverworts and hornworts. Most of you know what moss is. It's that kind of green, fluffy stuff, mossy stuff, right? That grows on rocks around stream beds. Mosses are non-vascular plants. They lack specialized tissue for transporting water and nutrients. They rely on diffusion to move materials into and out of their cells, osmosis, right? They typically live in moist habitats and grow close to the ground because they have to be close to the water. They don't have roots, they don't have stems to take up the water from the soil, so they have to live close to the water so that they can rely on osmosis and diffusion to move water and nutrients into and out of their cells. They don't produce seeds, that's why they are called seedless, and they don't have roots or stems or leaves or vascular tissue, so we call them non-vascular plants. Liverworts and hornworts are also examples of seedless non-vascular plants, and you can see here I have another picture of some moss. Here's a picture of a liverwort, and over here we have hornworts. You can Google liverworts and hornworts and see all kinds of pictures. All right, so now we're going to move on to vascular plants. We just talked about mosses, which are non-vascular. They don't have, that internal plumbing, if you will, to transport water and nutrients. Vascular plants do. Now, some vascular plants produce seeds and some don't, so we'll get into that in a little bit. But let's talk about two really important vocabulary terms here regarding vascular plants. Vascular plants have what is called xylem and phloem. You can pretend that's a Z, and that PH sounds like an F. Vascular plants have stems, roots, and leaves, and the specialized internal tissue that conducts water and minerals through the plant is called xylem and phloem. Xylem transports water, phloem transports glucose and other nutrients through the plant. Those are two vocabulary terms that you really just should commit to memory. Now, I said earlier, vascular plants, some of them produce seeds, some do not. Club mosses, horsetails, and ferns do not produce seeds. Gymnosperms and angiosperms do produce seeds. So we're going to start here with the club mosses, horsetails, and ferns. Those are your vascular plants, right? They do have that internal specialized tissue structure, but they don't produce seeds. So ferns are probably the vascular plant, seedless vascular plants that you're most familiar with. They've been around for about 390 million years, since the age of the dinosaurs. They're actually more complex than mosses, right, because they do have that vascular tissue. The vascular tissue allows ferns to grow much larger than mosses because ferns don't need to rely on simple diffusion to move materials in and out of their bodies. And in some parts of the world, ferns can even grow to be the size of trees. So let me show you some pictures here. We've got ferns, and these are club mosses, and these are called horsetails. And you can Google club mosses and horsetails, and you can see some many different pictures of all of these seedless vascular plants. All right, moving on to those vascular plants that do have seeds. So if I went back to my concept map, we just talked about vascular plants without seeds. So these would be your ferns right here. Now we're going to move on to vascular plants that do produce seeds, our gymnosperms and our angiosperms. The structures of gymnosperms and angiosperms make them even less dependent on water. Gymnosperms include pine trees and cedar trees. Angiosperms include all plants that produce flowers, from grasses to roses to maple trees. Gymnosperms and angiosperms both produce pollen, which is a tough protective coating surrounding a sperm cell. Pollen resists drying out, and for this reason it's a huge step towards solving the challenge of living on land. It can be carried between plants by wind currents or animals. And both gymnosperms and angiosperms produce seeds, or structures that protect and nourish a growing plant embryo. Seeds help resist drying out, freezing, fires, and even the digestive enzymes produced by animals, right? Animals can eat fruit, and the seeds come out in their waste, and that's how they help disperse the seeds of gymnosperms and angiosperms. So we'll cover gymnosperms a little bit more in detail. The term gymnosperm means naked seed, and it's a reference to the way in which gymnosperms produce seeds. Their seeds are usually held inside reproductive structures called cones, like pine cones, which release the seed directly to the environment when conditions are right. Pines, yews, and several other types of trees are classified as gymnosperms, and by definition, a gymnosperm is a seed plant that does not produce fruits or flowers. Gymnosperms include some of the oldest trees on Earth, like bristlecone pines, which can be more than 5,000 years old, and another gymnosperm, which is the giant sequoia, is the largest tree on Earth. In the cones of the ponderosa pine, the paper-thin seeds are located between thick scales of the cone. And let me show you a pine cone. I know most of you know what a pine cone looks like, but I'll go ahead and show it anyway. So in case you forgot what a pine cone looks like, right, you can see one here in the picture. I'm on page 8 of lesson 3.08. You can see here that's a pine cone, in case you didn't know. And again, pine cones are produced by gymnosperms. Now we'll move over to the other type of a vascular plant that produces seeds. Those are the angiosperms, or flowering plants. What do you think of when you hear flowering plants? You probably think of plants like roses, daisies, dandelions, but you could also think of wheat, or the grass in your front lawn, or oak and maple trees in the forest. These and many other plants are angiosperms, the group of plants that produce flowers. Flowers are actually reproductive structures. Like gymnosperms, angiosperms produce pollen. When pollen lands on a flower, sperm cells fertilize the egg cell within the flower, thus producing an embryo that eventually becomes encased by a seed. Shortly after fertilization, the structure surrounding the seed begins to swell. This structure, which we call the fruit, provides some protection to the growing seed. Its primary function, however, is to promote seed dispersal. Fruit and flowers are structural adaptations that have allowed flowering plants to live in just about every environment on land. Now we're going to take those angiosperms and break them up even further into two groups called, one group is called the monocots and the other is called the dicots. So let's talk a little bit more about that. If you look closely at the leaves of many angiosperms, you'll notice that the veins in the leaves either are parallel to each other or form a branching pattern. These characteristics help differentiate between two main groups of angiosperms, the monocots and the dicots. Monocots are plants that produce a seed containing one embryonic leaf. Dicots are plants that produce a seed containing 2 embryonic leaves. Many of the grains you eat, such as corn, wheat, and rice, are monocots, and so are flowers like lilies and tulips. So just to review, we have quickly surveyed the plant kingdom. Plants can be seedless, in other words, they don't produce seeds. Usually they produce spores like ferns, or seeded plants. Seedless plants like mosses are non-vascular. They don't have xylem and phloem to move water and nutrients. Ferns, though, although they don't produce seeds, they do have that xylem and phloem, so we call them vascular seedless plants. All the plants that produce seeds are actually vascular, so a seeded plant is also going to be a vascular plant. 2 groupings of seed-producing plants would be gymnosperms, which are your conifers, or they produce cones to protect their seeds, and then angiosperms are your flowering plants. The flower is the reproductive, or contains the reproductive structures of the plant, and then of course angiosperms are also going to produce fruits. Angiosperms can be broken down further into monocots, which means the embryo of the plant is going to have 1 leaf, or dicots, meaning the embryo of the plant is going to have 2 leaves.